Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for November 15th, 2021. I hope you had the opportunity to watch some of our conference over the weekend. The November 13th, November 14th Schiller Institute conference. I cannot adequately summarize what went on in the few minutes I have with this daily update. But I should point out to you it's all archived. You can watch it at the schillerinstitute.com website. It was 2 days of intense deliberation from people from important institutions from all over the world. The kind of discussion that should go on, but doesn't go on because of the control of the narrative by the corporate cartels who own the mainstream media and own most of the political networks that run governments in the transatlantic world. Now, to summarize what was said, I'll go to Helga Zepp-LaRouche's keynote, where she emphasized that the transatlantic system is about to disintegrate. And she said the cause for this is governments' refusal to acknowledge that their policies are failing because they were designed not for the general welfare, not based on principles or natural law, but based on a defense of their system, using fake science, speculative finance, regime change wars, and punitive sanctions to enforce what they call the rules-based order. It's not a rules-based order, it's a unipolar system that's run on and on the behalf of the City of London, Wall Street banks, Silicon Valley, and increasingly the European Central Bank at Brussels. Now, their policies have failed. Their endless wars have been a tremendous cost to countries in the West, particularly the United States. And yet they're doubling down on this with their threats against Russia and China, their continuation of sanctions. So let me take two examples of the failure of their policies just to emphasize the point. First, you have a lot of hysteria now, again, over global migration, refugee crisis, with a focus on the border between Poland and Belarus. The charge is that Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, is trying to punish the European Union for imposing sanctions on his country by sending refugees through the border into Poland where they'll disperse throughout the European Union. And they're saying Putin is working with him to cause this to occur. Now, Putin made a relevant point. The existence of refugees has nothing to do with anything that was done by Russia or Belarus, but the Western policies of regime change wars and sanctions. People are fleeing countries that have been destroyed by endless wars, by punitive sanctions that deny people access to food, access to fuel, access to medical supplies, and so on. And there's a real hypocrisy here for blaming Belarus when the European Union won't even talk to the president of Belarus, Lukashenko, because they're engaged in a regime change coup against him, accusing him of fraudulent election policy and demanding that he step down, and then blaming him for a crisis that was caused by the policies of the transatlantic governments. So I think this is just one example of the hypocrisy that we see from these Western governments. Now let's take a second one, the so-called, well, it's not a so-called, it is an energy crisis. The sudden unavailability of certain supplies, the high cost, the inflated cost. Now, what caused this? Is it that we suddenly ran out of oil, gas, coal, nuclear power? No, a deliberate policy to shut down the most efficient forms of electricity production in order to stick to the guidelines of the fake science. Now, they're cutting off credit, for example, under the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. Banks, insurance companies, equity funds, they're cutting off credit from people engaged in fossil fuel exploration and development and transportation. And they were threatening to use the Glasgow Summit to cut off credit for virtually any company that has a so-called carbon footprint. And of course, the inflation of prices is also due to the monetary pumping that's being done by the central banks that's connected to the Great Reset. Now, they're shutting down nuclear power and coal. They're refusing to license the Nord Stream 2. They're demanding adherence to Malthusian policies. This was the center of the issue at the just completed Glasgow conference. And why are they doing that? To back up their claims that man's activity on the planet is leading to global warming that will extinguish the human race within anywhere from 12 months to 10 years. This is the fake science. And by the way, this was refuted in the science panel, the third panel at the recently concluded Schiller Institute conference. But the failure of the COP26 was made clear in their one sentence where they had to change phase out coal to phase down use of coal. Now, this was a big defeat for the climate change mafia because they intended to use the summit to get rid of coal. As Bloomberg says, beyond coal, no more use of coal. And yet you have countries, especially in the developing sector, that are dependent on coal production for electricity. The opposition to the COP26 policy was summarized by India's environmental minister, Yadav, who is backed by China, South Africa, Nigeria, Iran, and other countries. What Yadav said is, quote, "Fossil fuels and their use have enabled the path for the world to attain a high level of wealth and well-being. Developing countries have rights to their fair share of the global carbon budget and are entitled to the responsible use of fossil fuels." We've been reporting that there's a rejection led by India, but supported by many other countries who have no access to energy outside of coal, and just in some cases, oil and gas. The idea that this should be cut back to attain some arbitrary concept of temperature reduction is a fraud. It's a strategy for mass murder. And that's why countries rebelled against it. Now, in reaction to the rebellion, we see, just as one example, a voice from London, from The Guardian, the environmental editor named Vidal, basically called for a war on dissenters, echoing Prince Charles's call for a warlike mobilization around the COP26. Vidal wrote that those countries which want progress, that is, the countries that are supporting the demands of COP26, should work outside the UN process. They can force changes, take the gloves off, treat those not going along as criminals. So criminalizing the use of coal to provide electricity in poor countries, that's the policy. That's coherent with Klaus Schwab, who said that the danger to the planet comes from people who want a better life. Well, people wanting a better life is part of an inherent human right, and organizing economies in such a way that people can have better lives is the responsibility of governments and populations. Demanding that that not take place so that people have to suffer, whether it's food shortages, whether it's lack of heat in the winter, in order to appease the Wall Street and City of London predators, that's not coherent with human rights. So the question then is, will we have a world that will be dominated by these utopian schemes to protect the most wealthy, the upper 1% of income brackets, against the interests of 7 to 8 billion people? Will they prevail, or will the human race prevail? That's the fight that we're engaged in. And I'd urge you to become better informed on this. Take some time, watch the Schiller Institute conference. It's 4 panels of a little more than 3 hours each, so it probably will take you a couple of days to do it. But it's well worth it, because it will give you an understanding of what the actual fight that we face, that humanity faces in the world today. So thanks for joining me today. I'll be with you every day this week.